Good day and welcome back to part 3. We are looking at English literature throughout English history. If you go back to my Learning Language Arts channel, you will notice I have a part 1 that covers after the Romans leave in 450, and I cover the Anglos, the Saxons, and the Middle Ages in part 1. And in part 2, I start covering the English Renaissance all the way through the Restoration up to about 1700. Welcome into part 3, where we're going to look at Augustan literature, and we're going to be looking this time in part 3 all the way up to the Romantic time around approximately 1800. So in part 3, we're going to cover about 100 years of English history in English literature. Let's start with Augustan literature, approximately 1700 to 1745. Now, during the 18th century, literature reflected the worldview of the Age of Enlightenment, otherwise known as the Age of Reason. Now, this is a rational and scientific approach to religious, social, political, and economic issues that promoted a secular view of the world and a general sense of progress and perfectibility. Led by the philosophers who were inspired by the discoveries of the previous century by the people like Isaac Newton and the writings of Descartes, John Locke, and Francis Bacon. Now, it was during this time that poet James Thomson produced his melancholy The Seasons, around 1728 to 1730, and Edward Young wrote his poem Night Thoughts in 1742. Though the most outstanding poet of the age arguably is Alexander Pope. It is also the era that saw a serious competition over the proper model for the pastoral in poetry. Drama in the early part of the period would feature the last plays of John Vanbrugh and William Congreve, both of whom carried on the Restoration comedy with some alterations. However, the majority of stagings were of lower farces and much more serious and domestic tragedies. George Lillo and Richard Steele both produced highly moral forms of tragedy, where the characters and the concerns of the characters were wholly middle class or even working class. Now, in prose, the early part of this period was overshadowed by the development of the English essay. Writers such as Joseph Addison and Richard Steele's The Spectator would establish the form of the British periodical essay. However, this was also the time when the English novel was first emerging. Daniel Defoe turned from journalism and writing criminal lives for the press to writing the fictional criminal lives with Roxana and Moll Flanders. Daniel Defoe's biggest writing, however, is arguably Robinson Crusoe in 1719. Now, if Addison and Steele were dominant in one type of prose, then Jonathan Swift, author of the satire Gulliver's Travels, was in another. In A Modest Proposal and the Drapier Letters, Swift reluctantly defended the Irish people from the predations of colonialism. Now, this provoked riots and arrests, but Jonathan Swift, who had no love of Irish Roman Catholics, was outraged by the abuses that he saw upon them. An effect of the Licensing Act of 1737 was to cause more than one aspiring playwright to switch over to writing novels. Henry Fielding, for example, began to write prose satire and novels after his plays could not pass the censors. Moving away from the Augustan period into the Age of Sensibility, which is the rest of our 1700s. It's also sometimes described as the Age of Johnson. Now, Samuel Johnson lived throughout the entire age, around 1709 to about 1784, and he's often referred to as Dr. Johnson. Now, Samuel Johnson was an English author who made lasting contributions to English literature as a poet, an essayist, a moralist, a literary critic, a biographer, an editor, and a lexicographer. Johnson has been described as arguably the most distinguished man of letters in English history. Now, one of his greatest works, after 9 years of works, his Dictionary of the English Language was published in 1755. And this has had a far-reaching effect on modern English and has been described as one of the greatest single achievements of scholarship. As we continue looking at the second half of the 18th century, we see the emergence of three major Irish authors: Oliver Goldsmith, Richard Brinsley Sheridan, and Lawrence Sterne. Goldsmith is the author of The Vicar of Wakefield from 1766, a pastoral poem of the deserted village in 1770, and two plays, The Good-Natured Man in 1768, and She Stoops to Conquer in 1773. Conversely, Sheridan's first play, The Rivals of 1775, was performed at Covent Garden and was an instant success. Now, as we're getting towards the end of the Age of Sensibility, we start seeing a bit of the Romantic movement coming in. The Romantic movement in English literature of the early 19th century has its roots in 18th century poetry, the Gothic novel, and the novel of sensibility. Now, continuing on in the Age of Sensibility, this is going to include the graveyard poets from the 1740s and later, whose works are characterized by gloomy meditations on mortality. To this was added by later practitioners a feeling for the sublime and uncanny, and an interest in ancient English poetic forms and folk poetry. Now, these poets include Thomas Gray, who wrote an elegy written in a country churchyard in 1751, and Edward Young, who wrote The Complaint, or Night Thoughts on Life, Death, and Immortality, from the ages of 1742 to about 1745. Now, continuing on, the sentimental novel, or novel of sensibility, is a genre which developed during the second half of the 18th century. It celebrates the emotional and intellectual concepts of sentiment, sentimentalism, and your age of sensibility. Sentimentalism, which is to be distinguished from sensibility, was a fashion in both poetry and prose fiction, which began in the 18th century in reaction to the very rational Augustan age. Among the most famous sentimental novels in English are Samuel Richardson's Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, in 1740. Oliver Goldsmith's Vicar of Wakefield, once again in 1776. Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy from about 1759 to 1767. And Henry Mackenzie's The Man of Feeling in 1771. Now, there's significant foreign influences, and that would be from the Germans Goethe, Schiller, and August Wilhelm Schlegel. We also see foreign influences from the French philosopher and writer Jean-Jacques Rousseau, around 1712 to 1778 for his birth and death dates. Edmund Burke's A Philosophical Enquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful in 1757 is going to be another important influence. The changing landscape brought about by the industrial and agricultural revolutions was yet another influence on the growth of the Romantic literary movement in Great Britain. Thank you so much for stopping by for part 3, which we looked from about 1700 to about 1800 at the Augustan Age and the Age of Sensibility in English literature. If you are loving this part, go back and check out part 1 and part 2 so you can cover the English parts of English history in English literature. And if you need any more, please leave a comment down below. Let me know what I've missed out so I can cover that for you as well. And as always, I appreciate it if you subscribed. Take care.